Good afternoon and welcome, Your Excellency, dear friends. Hellenic American Union, established as a binational center in 1957, developed into an institution of the civic society with deep roots in Athens and society in general. By the series, today's meeting is a part of a series of meetings we organized in order to explore the impact the Asia Minor catastrophe exercised on the Greek society, on the ethnic identity, Hellenic identity, and also the impact it had to the history of both sides of the Aegean Sea. Today's speaker is very well known from his books to everybody here, so he has no introduction from me, and his interlocutor, Ms. Purnara, doesn't need that either. So I thank you for being here, and let's start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to say a few words in Greek, and then we're going to switch to English. Ευχαριστημένοι που είμαστε εδώ ανάμεσα σε Έλληνες και Τούρκους φίλους και που έχω την ευκαιρία και το προνόμιο να μιλήσω με τον κύριο Μπρους Κλάρκ. Είναι ένας εκπληκτικός δημοσιογράφος και συγγραφέας και φαντάζομαι ότι οι περισσότεροι από εσάς έχετε διαβάσει το βιβλίο του που αφορά την ανταλλαγή των πληθυσμών του 1923, το «Δυο Φορές Ξένος», το οποίο έγινε και ένα καταπληκτικό ντοκιμαντέρ. Νομίζω ότι ήταν αποκαλυπτικό το βιβλίο σε ό,τι αφορά το πόσο τραυματικό ήταν αυτό το γεγονός τόσο για τους Έλληνες όσο και για τους Τούρκους. Και βοήθησε νομίζω πάρα πολύ και τις δύο κοινωνίες να καταλάβουν αυτή την αμοιβαιότητα του τραύματος. Ο κύριος Κλάρκ βέβαια έχει την καλοσύνη και μας υποσχέθηκε ότι θα μας μιλήσει λίγο και για το καινούριο του βιβλίο που λέγεται «Αθήνα, η πόλη της Σοφίας». Και είναι μια βιογραφία που καλύπτει μια περίοδο 3.000 ετών. Οπότε καταλαβαίνουμε το μέγεθος του εγχειρήματος. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. My name is Mαργαρίτα Πουρνάρα and I am a journalist in Καθημερινή newspaper. It is a joy and a privilege to have here Mr. Bruce Clark. He's a distinguished author and journalist. I guess you have all read, or most of you have read, his wonderful book, Twice a Stranger, which has to do with the exchange of population which took place in 1923 between Greece and Turkey. I think for both societies, Greece and Turkey, it was a revealing book because we understood how traumatic this event had been for both sides of the Aegean. And obviously this is the reason we asked Mr. Clark to come here and participate in this series of lectures for Asia Minor. But he also promised he's going to say a few words on his latest book, which is called Athens, City of Wisdom, and which is very interesting. It is a sweeping narrative about the history of Athens, 3,000-year long old narrative about this short biography of, or a long biography of our city, of our Greek capital. So my first question is obvious. How come you written this book, where it's a book which had an extensive research and it had so many interviews from survivors? You've written the book in the mid-2000s. So what was your goal, your personal motive when you were writing this book?
Well, thank you. Just to introduce myself a little bit. First of all, let me say that any of you whose families were affected by the population exchange will automatically know more about the subject than I do, and I deeply respect that. In a sense, what you're going to hear tonight is the perspective of an Anglophone coming from another place who is analysing this material both at a human level, both from diplomatic archives, and just working out what it looks like from my rather idiosyncratic perspective. I mean, what personal baggage do I bring to the subject? Well, I come from Northern Ireland, I come from rural Northern Ireland, and in a funny way that helps me to understand late Ottoman society quite well. I have a kind of instinctive feeling, I would say, for societies in which two communities live together in deep but ambivalent symbiosis, you might say. I mean, just to put that in more concrete terms, I was told a story by the head of the Συναντήσεις, the people in Greece who come from a particular place in Cappadocia, how he was on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and he understood that the waiter who was serving him was a young lad from Sinassos, Mustafa Pasha in Turkish terms. And of course there, in the middle of the Atlantic, they bonded very closely. And I can imagine that so easily in a Northern Irish context. I can imagine people from opposing communities meeting one another and bonding closely, but probably the further they are from their home place, the easier. So there are certain aspects of Ottoman society that my own background, in a sense, enables me to empathize with and understand. A particular welcome to the Irish ambassador, by the way. Now, I mean, I worked as a journalist in Greece in the 1980s. That's where I cut my teeth as a journalist. And I noticed sort of even back then that there were curious ambivalences in Greek-Turkish relations at a human level. I remember kind of a few weeks into my assignment as a journalist in Athens, going to a kind of diplomatic lunch at the Grand Bretagne and sitting next to a Greek diplomat who had just served in Ankara. And of course the headlines at that time were full of extremely dramatic developments between Greece and Turkey, and if one had judged by the headlines, the two countries were on the brink of war. And I said to the diplomat, well, it must have been rather difficult serving in Ankara, I suppose. To which he replied, well, yes, it was in some ways, but of course the human relations with our Turkish counterparts were always extremely good. Now, I mean, I understand that now, but at the time it was rather puzzling. I mean, you wouldn't sort of, if you met an American diplomat who just served in Moscow, he said, well, of course, with the Russian counterparts, our human relations were very good. I mean, you'd be surprised by that, wouldn't you? So that was a little puzzle for me back then, which I think I understand a bit better now. Also, if I think of the stories I wrote as a journalist in the 80s, I mean, I met Manolis Andronikos, the great archaeologist, who made the discovery of Egine and really kind of identified, the Macedonian palaces, one of the great heroes, if you like, of Greek Macedonian history. And, where was he born? He was actually born in what you would call in Greek terms Bursa. Now, what does a kind of a young, foreign correspondent, learning about Greek culture, what do you learn first? Well, you learn about Theodorakis, you learn about Seferis, you learn about the songs of Theodorakis, which set to music Seferis, and then, you look up the biography of both people, and you see that, Theodorakis' mother came from Chesme, and, Seferis himself was, of course, born in Urfa, and these people both have origins, in present-day Turkey. So lots of puzzles to young me. I mean, I had been assigned to cover Greece, the Republic of Greece, but nonetheless, I understood that there were things about Greece that I couldn't properly appreciate unless I took on board, the deep roots that people had on the other side, so to speak. So that's a bit of autobiography and a bit of explanation.
But coming to this book, what was your motive? What did you want it? What was the story behind it?
Well, yes, more specifically, I mean, in the year 2003, I mean, I was looking for a topic in sort of modern Greek or sort of Balkan history, to address myself to. I had taken a sabbatical from work, and I even considered writing about the modern Olympic Games, but lots of other people were doing that. And then I remembered the fact that I travelled quite a bit around northern Greece, both Thessaloniki, which I always enjoyed going to, and to kind of villages and country places in northern Greece. And I suppose by then I understood that sort of 2/3 of the population of Thessaloniki has its roots in Asia Minor, in Greek terms. And so much of the social life of the city, the cultural life, even the cuisine, can only be understood in terms of the Asia Minor roots of most people there. And then, going around the rural areas in northern Greece, it's still noticeable that some villages are inhabited by people from, in Greek terms, Pontos, some from Cappadocia, some from Thrace, some so-called local people, dopyi, and so the different refugee origins are very much part of the social reality of northern Greece. So that was, and that sort of got me thinking about the whole thing, and I began researching, and I came to understand better that this was a phenomenon that affected both sides of the Aegean, and that's more or less how I got into the book. I remember sort of early in 2003, my year of research, going to an NGO in Istanbul which specialized in the stories of people on the Turkish side who'd been affected by the population exchange. And I spoke to a young assistant there, and I explained that I was hoping to write a book on the subject. And she looked at me with a glance of absolute sort of contempt and incomprehension as to how anybody so totally uninformed of myself, who didn't speak more than a few words of Turkish, could attempt such a thing. And I began to think, well, maybe she's right. Maybe she has a point. But nonetheless, I persisted.
So no single event it was so impactful on Greek nation and society. So I was wondering, 100 years, a century later, what are the lessons learned by it, and in what ways it has shaped Greece, modern Greece, contemporary Greece?
Well, I mean, I would ask you to look at the subtitle of the book, which is actually slightly different between the British and American editions. The British edition has the subtitle, How Mass Expulsion Forged Modern Greece and Turkey. The American edition, I think it was The Mass Expulsions That Forged Modern Greece and Turkey. And that was, it was a happy coincidence almost that we chose that title, because the word forged has two meanings, doesn't it? I mean, it means created, these expulsions in a sense created Greece and Turkey in their present form, but it also distorted them. It was there was an element of falsehood, I suppose, as there is in all national projects. There was an element of distortion, but also an element of creation. And I suppose, in a sense, the immediate effect on the sort of political projects on both sides of the Aegean was to create a sort of an illusion of homogeneity on both sides. I mean, it laid the basis for both states to set about a very energetic nation-state building project, where, in a sense, people were artificially homogenized, a difference was denied, anything that sort of differentiated the refugees in Greece from the so-called native Greek population was played down, and I think in a sense we're still living with that. We're still living in the ideology of the nation-state, which sort of emphasizes homogeneity and denies diversity. But of course, in the year 2021, that's more and more difficult because it's more and more at odds with what we actually experience in our daily life.
You have done a very thorough research in order to write this book, but I think what makes this book really exciting is the accounts of refugees themselves, both Turkish and Greek. Why did it take us so long to hear their own version, to hear the voice talking about this event?
Well, I suppose, yes, maybe I was one of the first people who brought these voices to an English-speaking public, because, I mean, they were, in a sense, they were available already in various ways. I mean, for example, there's a series of books under the title Extrodos, published by the Center for Asia Minor Studies, and that includes quite long, sort of unedited almost accounts, personal histories by refugees, and I use them, and I make, and where I use them, of course, I credit the centre. So these accounts did exist, but they weren't much available in English, and perhaps especially not available on the Turkish side as well. And I was lucky enough to be researching at a time when there were still individuals, by necessity in the 90s, who actually had quite vivid memories of the exchange. And even as, say you were a 10-year-old child at the time of the exchange, that's enough to, a bright 10-year-old can retain a lot of things. And you may notice that I devote 7 or 8 pages to one especially interesting individual, who grew up in the mountains, near Trabzon, and he had extraordinarily vivid memories of his early childhood. And I must have gone to see him half a dozen times in his apartment in Thessaloniki. I never put a tape recorder on because I think that would have disturbed him. I just took handwritten notes. And then I kind of prepared a text, which was my attempt to articulate his memoirs. And then I shared it with him and asked was he, and I got my English text sort of translated back into Greek, and we went through it, and was that the name of your cow, or was that when the Russian soldiers came, and every little detail. And I think that the end result, I think, was true to what he wanted to say. A nice, very, very nice man called George Siamanidis, who died only quite recently. He died in 2017 or 2018 at the age of 104. So I was lucky enough to have long interactions with this fine gentleman.
What about the Turkish refugees?
Well, I was helped by a number of different sort of individuals and agencies in Turkey, including the Lausanne Mübadele Vakfı, the Lausanne Exchanges Foundation, and also there was a nice journalist in Istanbul, Iskender Özsoy, who has devoted his life really to gathering the stories of exchangees, and they led me to a number of individuals, both in the around Istanbul and where else, in Ayvalık, of course. I managed to catch sort of 2 of the great characters of Ayvalık. There's a certain Ali Bey from Crete, who's kind of was the uncrowned king of Trunda, Mosconesia, had extremely vivid memories of Crete. And he used to say the same thing to everybody who interviewed him, whether it was in Greek or Turkish. He said, I know the day I die, my children are going to ask the palyagis, to come and collect all my trinkets from Crete and throw them out because they're of no interest to the younger generation. He would say it in Greek, he would say it in Turkish, and I sincerely hope that he was proved wrong, and he has passed on. And then, of course, there was the novelist Ahmet Yorulmaz, another sort of character from Ayvalık. So I was able to catch some of those sort of senior figures in the exchangee community.
A large number of the Greek refugees settled down in Macedonia,
Indeed, yes.
as we said earlier. And I was wondering whether in this part of Greece, collective memory is stronger, or people rather not want to talk about their traumas, their family traumas.
Yes, look, I would say the memory is certainly strong. It is kind of, it's, and in a way, I had a very memorable sort of few days around Grivina, in villages around Grivina. And with a nice young friend, Panos Papoulios, who kind of comes from Grivina, and he took me around some of the local villages. And in some of these villages, the elderly people still spoke Turkish. It was their preferred language. They were strongly kind of Greek nationalist in consciousness, but the language in which they were most comfortable was Turkish. And it would be explained to me, oh no, they speak a bit of a dialect of Greek. It's a bit different. And of course, it wasn't any Greek dialect. It was Turkish. But nonetheless, I pretended not to notice. And actually, one of the vivid memories I have of touring the villages of Grivina is that they were still very conscious of which village was which. Which was one was Poni, one was Dopye, one was Thrakiotes, whatever. And I remember the expression, "Από αυτό το χωριό δεν παίρναμε ούτε δίναμε." From that village, we didn't take and we didn't give. Now, what do you suppose the object of that verb was? Because luckily, I immediately guessed it was brides, nifes. Then pename nifes, or diviname nifes. You know, so, it was a way of kind of signalling the very keenly felt difference in the 30s. But I would say that the net result of the Second World War, for all the tragedies that unfolded, I would say in particular the net result of the Albanian campaign was to draw these communities together and to ultimately to bridge these differences. I think in a sense, when these people spoke about not taking brides or not giving brides, they were hitting the nail on the head. Either intermarriage occurs or it doesn't. And when you have the same religion, where there's no religious barrier to intermarriage, then intermarriage will happen, and then the differences will gradually melt away. So it was clearly very keenly felt in the 30s, and it played out in all sorts of often tragic, political ways during the occupation and the Civil War. But ultimately, these social divisions were sort of on the road to being overcome.
I think the most touching part of your book is the vivid memories of coexistence, of peaceful coexistence. Yes. Would you tell us more about it? Yes,
of course. People spoke about coexistence sort of in Ottoman times, before all the trouble started. But there was also a kind of a subset of memories, which concerns the situation that arose when Orthodox Christian refugees were arriving in northern Greece, and Muslims were about to be sent away to Turkey, and for a time, two families would have to occupy the same property, the same household. And quite often there were sort of perversely warm memories of the coexistence, the temporary coexistence between the incoming Greek Orthodox family and the outgoing Muslim family. And of course, they all spoke Turkish. They had a common language, so there was no and sometimes according to the memories, which you have to kind of filter a little bit, the Greek Orthodox family would say, well, I'll give you a bit of advice about our village, or don't go there. This is the best place to settle, and so on. Now, of course, you have to take all that with a pinch of salt, and certainly there is also evidence of conflict between the two groups. But I suppose what's key to that situation is that, in a sense, the fate of everybody had been determined. There was no point in fighting. Because an irrevocable decision had been taken that the Muslims were going to leave and the Orthodox Christians were going to come in. Both communities were under an unbearable constraint, and so there was nothing to fight over. And they might as well get on, and they did get on, at least for the few months that they lived together.
Your book was translated in both languages, so I was wondering, 100 years after this tragic event, whether we have more tolerance and understanding for our neighbors, vice versa.
Gosh, yes. Certainly, it was. Certainly, I was delighted to see the book translated in both languages, and I was delighted that it was launched quite successfully in both countries. And as you briefly mentioned, there was a television series entitled Dυο Φορές Ξένος, and an exhibition which was shown successfully in both countries, and in other places too, in Berlin and in Cyprus and so on. So the very fact that it was translated and quite well received in both countries is in itself an encouraging sign. I would say that in Turkey it was mainly received by a particular group of liberal intellectuals. I wouldn't say, in a sense, one could predict sort of which bookshops in Istanbul would stock it, and we had a launch event in Bilgi University, and such a book would appeal to a very specific slice of the Turkish public, and maybe not so much to the general public. Look, this was, and the book was launched in the sort of the mid-noughties, right? And so we were still benefiting from the earthquake diplomacy, and generally sort of Greek-Turkish relations, having come very, very close to conflict in spring 1999, were on an upswing, and there was the what academics call the baklava effect, when there were many conferences, including sort of Greek and Turkish academics and cultural figures, and they would celebrate how much they had in common, and including a common taste for baklava, and even in television serials, there was this sort of fashion for Turkish soap operas in Greece, and generally, and the film Politika Kuzina had come out, so the whole climate was quite favourable to sort of a cultural product which took note of commonality between the two countries. I can only guess that it would be more difficult now. I'm sorry to say, but
how would you describe today's relationship between two countries as a journalist? I mean, not as a writer.
Well, look, I mean, in a sense, society to society, I think sort of the two countries know each other better than they used to. That's perhaps the only, the most positive thing I can say. I mean, when I worked in Greece in the 1980s, the climate was such that it was considered sort of almost treacherous to know too much about Turkey. I mean, to even to know who were the members of the Turkish government, and to think that sort of one might be slightly better or worse than the other, was just considered utterly treacherous. So people, because Turkey at that time was literally, in official discourse, it was the other side of the other side of the moon, the other side of the looking glass. Now, I mean, in a sense, I can't judge what interstate relationships are like, and there are some very worrying signs that anybody can see. But I do think that, for better or worse, the two societies know each other better now than they did.
So this could help, you think?
Well, it's better that way than let me tell you, in the 1980s. There had been a military coup in Turkey in 1980, and it was presented to the Greek public as literally, the heart of darkness. Of course, lots of people were still kind of very quietly going to Turkey, but it was kind of in official discourse, in the discourse of newspapers. It was, you would have thought it was like, some accursed kingdom that was sort of that occurred only in nightmares. And I remember when the opposition leader of the time, Mitsotakis, described the Turkish president Evren as sophron, prudent, as sort of a mildly positive characteristic for a Turkish. I mean, there was an absolute scandal. I mean, how, the very idea that sort of, regardless of what he does or says, I mean, to apply the word sophron to a Turkish leader was just simply shocking. And, I mean, very serious as the problems are now, I think that we're in a sort of, at least, I mean, as societies and even as political systems, we do sort of know each other, and we know each other's pathologies a bit better now than then.
But sometimes I do have the idea that when Greeks travel to Istanbul, they have this nostalgic feeling, and usually they never look under the surface. It's just this quest for Byzantium, or sort of food, or
yes.
They don't want to discover how average Turks think or feel, or sometimes I do have this certainty that they just look for different things, but not to discover contemporary Turkey.
Yes, I understand. But yes, they look for kind of for familiar reference points. But of course, what anybody from Greece sees traveling to Turkey now is what has happened in Hagia Sophia, and other monuments which are kind of in different ways dear to Greek hearts, and that's, in a sense, I would say, profoundly alien to the spirit of Lausanne, in a way. I mean, I think that the Lausanne Treaty didn't deal with the status of Hagia Sophia. It was dealt with in the 1930s, but I think that the status quo that existed, in which both the Islamic calligraphy and the Christian mosaics were exposed, and the place was a monument that people of all faiths and none could visit, I think that was very faithful to, if you like, the best of the Lausanne arrangement, and I think that whether your feeling for Hagia Sophia is that of a kind of secularist art historian, or it's somebody who sees the building in a more spiritual way, what has happened is, I mean, it sends a very negative signal.
Speaking about the Lausanne Treaty, the treaty established the borders of modern Turkey, but in recent years, Ankara has carried out a number of unilateral acts and called for its revision. So what is your view on this?
Well, all I will say is, in a sense, the one aspect of the Lausanne arrangement that, as far as I know, has not been called into question, at least as the written provisions have not been called into question, are those provisions which concern the population exchange. And it's a striking feature of diplomatic history that the people who were expelled as a result of the population exchange convention, the Orthodox Christians on one side, the Muslims on the other, they never again featured in diplomatic history, because it was sort of, Turkey, of course, lost interest completely in the Orthodox Christians who left for Greece. Greece had no further interest in the Muslims who left for Turkey. And at that level, there was a certain grim kind of success about the project. And to the extent that the provisions on population exchange caused trouble, it was always about the exceptions. And the exceptions are, of course, the Muslim population of Western Thrace and the Greek population of Istanbul, and indeed the Patriarchate. All these, have been topics, over the years of kind of, intense diplomatic argument at various phases. But the people who were expelled never again troubled any diplomat, because their fate was considered dealt with. And as far as I know, that remains the case.
This idea of the exchange of population, which sounds horrific today, when it was forged, it was not in 1923, but it was quite earlier, and then the First World War stopped
yes,
politicians
that's right.
from having such plans.
That's right. I mean, well, there had been a very small population exchange between Turkey and Bulgaria in 1913, affecting a few tens of thousands of people on both sides. And it was a way of clearing up the situation after the end of the Second Balkan War. And in fact, it was considered a friendly gesture by both sides, that we're not about to go back to war again, so let's tidy up the demographics by encouraging people to move across the frontier. Then, in the course of 1914, the Turkish authorities began pressing Greece to accept a population exchange of, at least the Greeks in the hinterland of Smyrna for the Muslims of newly Greek Macedonia. But it was, the background is that the Greeks on the coast of Asia Minor were being expelled anyway. So there were diplomatic messages from Turkey to the effect that, well, shall we make this official? And to which Venizelos' reply is that that in principle he was prepared to accept that idea as long as it was voluntary. There was so the logic of, as it were, swapping Muslims in Macedonia for Greeks around Smyrna was around and even accepted in principle by 1914, and then of course it was overtaken by the First World War. So.
Well, you wrote the book 20 years ago, before Twitter, before Facebook. Yes. So I was wondering if you were writing the same book today, would it be different?
Well, yes. Well, look, it would have to be more audiovisual. I mean, I would have to do, as far as possible, I think I would have to do the interviews with old people. I'd have to film them, and I'd have to maybe with subtitles, and I couldn't rely on the written word alone. I think that would be the main difference. Yeah.
What about your latest book?
Well.
How come you made the decision to write this book?
Well, let me say that first of all, this was a challenge from a publisher. It wouldn't have been my idea to attempt to write the story of Athens over 3,000 years or 4,000 years or whatever. A publisher, whom I respect, approached me and asked me, was I willing to write a longue durée history of Athens. It was pointed out that there were such histories of Istanbul, of Rome, of London even, and nobody sort of had, in quite that vein, had attempted a sort of what I would call a middle-brow history of Athens over the many centuries, including the times when, you know, Athens falls into a degree of obscurity in so-called Frankish Athens, the Catalan period, the period of the French Duchy, the period of the Italian bankers and so on. So nobody had really attempted to tell the entire story. And of course, in the course of looking into the whole sweep of Athenian history, I think I did understand the refugee story better as well. I was reminded of the fact that the population of Athens doubled as a result of the influx of refugees, and indeed the population of the Demos Athenaion, the sort of the narrowly defined Athens, very nearly doubled. And entire new districts sprang up. That they were built to some extent by the Refugee Settlement Commission, but they were also built by the refugees themselves. And there are certain parts of Greater Athens whose character still to this day very much reflects their origins as refugee settlements. That would include Kokinia, Nikia in the Piraeus region, Kessariani, Nea Ionia, and then of course the slightly more prosperous refugee inhabited places of Nea Smyrne and Kalisea. I was quite influenced in my writing by a landmark work of sociology written by a friend of mine who spent time in Kokinia in the early 70s, René Hirschhorn. Now in her book, Heirs of the Catastrophe, she describes sort of the social life of Kokinia, and she makes clear how very, very powerful the refugee memories are. And it's a very important work of social anthropology. And it made plain that this was a relatively poor community, but nonetheless a very robust and resilient and self-organizing community, with a very sort of keen sense of what they had brought from Asia Minor, the traditions of hospitality, how to cope with bereavement, how Orthodox Christian customs were played out in the home as much as in church and so on. But of course, there is an elephant in the room, as I now realize more clearly than I did. And the elephant in the room is that this was the time of the colonel's regime, and in retrospect, it seems to me that the good people of Kokinia were talking a lot about their Asia Minor roots, and everything they said was true. But in a way, they were talking a lot about that in order to avoid the much more recent memories of the Second World War and the extremely fierce battles and mass arrests which had taken place in Kokinia. The so-called bloko, when lots of people were arrested, and it was really one of the most sort of violent centers during the occupation and the events that followed. And this was very little discussed, and on the contrary, the refugee events of 50 years earlier were much more discussed. So I think I understand better how being sort of highly focused on one piece of the past can also be a way of blotting out another.
Most Greeks, they would like to be loved for their modern selves, not just ancient glory, and I think this is what you do in your book. So have you understood us better now?
Well, gosh, yes. In a way, I suppose. Well, I suppose I've been made to think sort of more about the perpetual ebb and flow of Hellenism, and the way that Hellenism is historically it has mostly existed sort of in a vast diaspora, in a vast sort of commonwealth of states and cities, and only in modern times has Hellenism been consolidated in one state, and to a degree in one city. That was kind of in a sense, when I say that the population exchange had a distorting effect, a very large number of people were bunched together in Athens. Athens, as a result, became a real city. Piraeus and central Athens were connected, and the northern suburbs emerged, and it was no longer the charming small town which had received the Olympic Games in 1896. It became a real, highly diverse, hard to manage city. But there was, this bunching together of a very, very big slice of Hellenism, in a single space, and this sort of, in a sense, denial of difference. It had something, artificial about it, and it was a and also temporary as well. Now, I was prompted, in the course of writing my chapter about the 20s and 30s, I was prompted to reread, a famous poem of Seferis about sort of people meeting in Athens on the street in the 1930s. It's a fantastically sort of modern poem. It reminds me vividly of the kind of conversations that Greeks have on Twitter, completely random sort of, apparently trivial conversations on Twitter. Greek Twitter is different from English Twitter, I've noticed. And the conversation which Seferis sort of portrays is taken from Greek Twitter 2021. And do you know the one? Would you allow me to read both? What I'll do is I'll read you my English translation, and I'll attempt to read the Greek as well. Okay. So my English translation of this little extract from Seferis, and it's about. His point is that what you have is a city of superficially urban people who are pretending to be city dwellers, but in fact, their minds are on, the sea, the islands, the recent tragedies. Their minds are elsewhere, but they're pretending very hard to be city dwellers. And this is my translation. What are they up to, all these people who say they're from Athens or Piraeus? One comes in from Salamis, and he asks some fellow, I suppose you're on the way from Ammonia. Oh no, the other one says, all pleased, from Syndagma. I ran into Yanni, and he stood me an ice cream. Meanwhile, Greece travels onwards, and we know nothing. We do not know that all of us are sailors high and dry. We have not grasped the bitterness of harbours where every ship has sailed, and those who do sense it, we mock. So that was my translation of Seferis, and I will try, to the best of my ability, to read the original. Ένας έρχεται από την Σαλαμίνα και ρωτάει τον άλλον, μήπως έρχεται εξ Ομονίας? Όχι, έρχομαι εξ συντάγματος, απαντά. Είναι ευχαριστημένος. Βρήκα τον Γιάννη και με κέρδισε ένα παγωτό. Στο μεταξύ η Ελλάδα ταξιδεύει και δεν ξέρουμε τίποτα. Δεν ξέρουμε πως είμαστε ξέμπαρκοι όλοι εμείς. Δεν ξέρουμε την πίκρα του λιμανιού που σαν ταξιδεύουν όλα τα καράβια. So that was one of my little inspirations.
So, we decided that we can have 2 or 3 questions from the audience. So,
δέχομαι ερωτήσεις και ελληνικά.
Και ελληνικά. We have to find a microphone though. Κάπου υπάρχει ένα μικρόφωνο ή όποιος μιλήσει θα πρέπει να μιλήσει με δυνατή φωνή για να τον ακούσουν και στην ζωντανή μετάδοση. Υπάρχει κάποια ερώτηση?
Ναι.
Ελληνικά, ναι.
Θα σας ευχαριστήσουμε πάρα πολύ για την πάρα πολύ ωραία συνομιλία που είχατε. Θα εστιάσω στο πρώτο σκέλος της συζήτησης που αφορούσε την ανταλλαγή πληθυσμών. Κάτι το οποίο πάντα με απασχολούσε είναι το εξής. Στην Ελλάδα δεν έχουμε διαπαιδαγωγηθεί ώστε να συμπεριλάβουμε στην δική μας κουλτούρα το τουρκικό πράγμα του εκπατρισμού. Είναι κάτι καινούργιο να το υποδεχόμαστε σαν κάτι, σαν τη φυσιολογική συνέχεια που πρέπει να την έχουμε υπόψη και να τη σεβόμαστε. Θέλω να ρωτήσω, στην Τουρκία, από την δική της εμπειρία, το ελληνικό τραύμα, τι θέση έχει στο δικό τους narrative?
Well, I'll answer, yes, I'll do my best to answer, and if you'll allow me to answer in English.
It's true that there isn't much in Greek or in Greece about the Turkish trauma. I will tell you a couple of counterexamples. In Previlakis, I think there's a passage about the Muslims leaving Crete and the great lamentation of the 40,000 or so Muslims who were the last to leave Crete and how much they loved the island. There is also an interesting autobiographical novel by Michalis Papakonstantinou in which he describes the life of his native Kozani, and he describes a very devout lady asking a priest to celebrate a Eucharist and Holy Liturgy for the, for her friends, and she says, and I'd like you to remember the Muslims who are leaving. And the priest says, well, how can we remember them? I mean, they're infidels. And then the woman says, no, they're decent people, and we must remember them too. So that's one small counterexample. So yes, I mean, there isn't much. You're quite right. There isn't much on the Greek side about the Muslim trauma. I mean, on the Turkish side, I mean, I think that in literature, as far as I know, I mean, I rely on this on sort of various, Turkish literary critics to inform me on this. I mean, only in the last couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades, has the whole story of the exchange and indeed the Rum population begun to surface in Turkish literature. And I think, I mean, as far as I know, I mean, there is, in Turkish literature, you will find attractive portrayals of, Rum characters in the situation that existed, before the exchange. So there will be, there is portrayal of Ottoman society in which the Rum had a place, and, the Rum characters can be nice people. But about the pain of the exchange, I'm honestly not sure. I'm not aware of any Turkish literature that actually directly addresses that.
Κύριος Κιτροέφ.
I have a question that bounces off.
Sure, please.
With a comment first.
Yes.
You spoke about no apologies
Sure.
for being an English speaker studying Greece. I think Greeks love this perspective. Although it strikes me that the one person writing from the English language perspective who bothered to talk about refugees is someone with an Irish background.
Yes,
So
yes, indeed.
The powerful punch that your book delivers is conveying the common experiences of both the Turks and the Greeks. And I remember at the end of Maria Iliou's documentary, you give this brilliant summing up. You speak about politicians and diplomats being, it's their job to draw lines. And people have to suffer the exchange. And what we learn from them having these common experiences is that we don't belong to lines. We have different. We carry different cultures.
Absolutely.
In us.
Yes.
However, the sheer size of the Greek influx compared to the relatively smaller size of the Turkish one means that the Greeks are in a position to learn more lessons about multiculturalism through the exchange than the Turks. Question mark.
Yes, and that depends what you mean by multiculturalism.
Yes, I guess what has evolved, over the years is a greater willingness to accept that, the Greek refugees, represent a diversity of experiences and diversity of regions, and that, that the Pondi, the Black Sea people, are entitled to cultivate their own dialect and cultivate traditions which are distinctive to the Black Sea, and that that the Cappadocians have a whole different set of memories, and so to that extent, the kind of forced uniformity has been greatly eased. Now, whether that means an openness to diversity in a broader sense, I would not be sure about that.
Ο κύριος Μασαβέτης.
Thank you for this talk and my as well. I would like actually, it's not a question really, but to share an observation with you and to, from my own work on Asian mind, and to sort of ask you whether you share, you've noticed it yourself, that so much in Greece was among the sort of Asian minor refugee population, so the emphasis was on preserving the memory. At family level, at the collective level of recitation, but very early on you mentioned the work of the Centre of Asian Minor Studies, etc. So families do very, very much cherish the memory of exactly where they came from, when, why, the history, their sort of customs, the dialect times. And I was shocked initially to find out that so much effort was put there in forgetting, sort of erasing everything. You won't find places in Turkey like, you won't find the Yeni Seres, Yeni Drama, Yeni Yanya, as we'll find many there, and whatever you might have. I realized that there was immense pressure on people who, I know from my very close friends, who were basically their forefathers were only Albanian or Slavic speaking, to actually sort of adopt the language, and they were very often Bektashi. They were forced to sort of abandon heterodox Islam for Sunni Islam. And my impression is that the education, the state, and wider society actually stigmatized them for not being, even though, I don't know if that was your impression, but another funny thing for me to realize that in Greece, and I know from my own family, coming from Asia Minor was always, and Asia Minor itself was kind of the promised land, or sort of like, they themselves believed it conferred them sort of a better status and background than being from old Greece, whereas the Balkans in particular were seen as kind of that almost weird barbaric wilderness. Whereas in Turkey it's very interesting that the Balkan Turks, those who came to the exchange, always, and maybe because the political class after Kemal's actually revolution and cultural revolution as well, you can say, they always looked toward the Balkans, and Anatolia, as they say, like Asia Minor, is seen as this sort of backwards region. And I remember, just a small joke, like of a very Balkan family of Turks, the sort of 50-year-old daughter, they took her mother to the Asian side of Istanbul. It was very, very sunny on the European side. They arrived in Kadikya, which is right across the channel, it's the heart of Asia Minor. It started raining, and the sort of like 80-year-old mother said, "Well, of course, my dear, what do you expect? It's Anatolia all round, isn't it?"
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Did you find that?
Yes, no, I think that everything you say is very fair.
I think the big exception might be is the Cretans, who are, and of course, who do, whether it's in Ayvalık or other places. I mean, the Cretans stubbornly maintain memories of their home place, but they often, in a sense, to give themselves permission to be very loyal to Crete, they have to be extra loyal Kemalists. I've noticed that sort of, I mean, in Turkey, those people who might otherwise be sort of suspected of being not fully national, they have to, really sometimes go to the other extreme and become, and so, there's a strongly nationalist spirit in Ayvalık, as you'll have seen. In Greece, I've noticed, and you'll have noticed that, I mean, people of sort of Turkish-speaking Christian background, and the Cappadocians in particular, they often, emphasize that they are particularly devout Orthodox Christians. In a sense, they use that as a sort of compensating mechanism. Yes, we gave up our language, and we had a choice. Either we give up our language or our religion, and so we kept our religion, and it was a kind of an act of self-sacrifice. And you should respect us for that. So on both sides, there's a kind of compensating mechanism.
Ο κύριος έχει μία ερώτηση.
The great pain that this population exchange had on both sides, are we in both countries aware of the great positive impact of this exchange as regards, for instance, the population in various countries? I believe that the life in Greece has increased itself, the mother country, has changed tremendously, and apart from the other benefits that we had in the combination of the population, for instance, in Macedonia, where the population was not, as you probably you mentioned that in Thessaloniki, the Greeks were 1/3 of the population and so on. Are we aware of that?
Well, certainly, as far as sort of agricultural practices in northern Greece, they were, hugely improved. I mean, both by the refugees themselves and by the Refugee Settlement Commission. I mean, lots of land was drained, and land was farmed in a much more efficient way as a result of the exchange. And of course, I mean, in Athens, in the cities, you might say, would this be fair to say, that Greece acquired both a bourgeoisie and a proletariat? It acquired, a bourgeoisie in the sense that, a number of, leading Istanbul, Constantinople families, or Smyrna families even, brought their sophistication and their international connections to Athens, and became a new business class in Athens. And Greece was certainly the beneficiary of that, undoubtedly.
Ο κύριος.
I have two questions. One is from the perspective of writing your 3,000-year history of Athens. As an outsider, in a sense, why does Hellenism as a kind of identity endure over 3,000 years, given the various occupations it's been through and all the rest of it? And then the second question, particularly being in this building, was the role that the Americans played in rehousing, feeding, technical know-how, et cetera, that allowed all these refugees to become integrated so quickly into Greek society.
Yes. Well, gosh, that's two big questions. Well, let me say that sort of researching the book on Athens, I mean, it convinced me more of the continuity of Hellenism, but at the same time, it made me realize that, the ebb and flow of Hellenism between different regions and different political structures and so on, and right, I will oversimplify a bit, but in a sense that if you were making a case for the cultural and linguistic continuity of Hellenism over the centuries and millennia, in a way that case can be made more strongly with respect to the once Greek cities and settlements on the west coast of Turkey than it can to anywhere else. And when that population sort of flowed into Athens and other parts of Greece, that was a great affirmation of the continuity of Hellenism. I mean, it's hard, when you look at the history of Athens as a village, as a town. I mean, there are times when it's a place of very, very little consequence, little more than a village. The one thing that doesn't change, of course, is the Acropolis. The Acropolis remains strategically and spiritually important in all epochs. But Athens itself is little more than a straggling village at times. So, I mean, it's in Asia Minor, above all, that you will see this extraordinary continuity. And when that was transferred to Athens, Athens and Greece were transformed as a result. Certainly I understood all that more clearly. About the American contribution, certainly, I mean, well, in a sense, there are two different things, aren't there? I mean, there is the extraordinary contribution of the American Red Cross to immediate humanitarian relief within the first few months of the arrival of the refugees, when I mean, many of them might have died of starvation or of infectious diseases, and it was just a matter of feeding as many as possible. It was one of the sort of greatest humanitarian operations, by a voluntary group in history, perhaps the greatest. So this, the role of the American Red Cross is saved so many lives. And then, of course, the more subtle role of the American diplomats in the Refugee Settlement Commission, and indeed the role of Henry Morgenthau, as a very visionary figure, who understood that, that short-term relief was one thing, but long-term resettlement was another, and it would require sort of international finance, and this finance would require collateral, and he had a very sophisticated, in a sense, a banker's vision of what was needed to resettle the refugees. And I mean, I couldn't agree more that this should be remembered.
I'm going to have
Please,
that question.
please.
Right behind us is the Acropolis.
Okay.
So,
yes, okay.
what about reunification of Parthenon marbles? Any
Well,
chance?
well, look, I mean, I think the climate in Britain is changing. I think that when you see editorials in the Times, a paper I used to work for, advocating the reunification of the marbles, and that's a new slogan, not return but reunification. I'm a great admirer of the Acropolis Museum. It already possesses a good share of the frieze, the Zoophoros, and it does seem to make sense that the frieze, which was deliberately broken up, should be reintegrated, returned, and I can't think of a better place to do it than the Acropolis Museum. But I attended the famous debate in the Oxford Union with Boris Johnson as chairman and Millian Mercuri as speaker, and there was also a brilliant Oxford philosopher called Michael Dummett who spoke, and he was and using a kind of very low-key English humor, he said, just ask you to do a thought experiment. Just just imagine that the marbles were still in Athens and they'd never left, you know. Would anybody see the marbles in Athens and say, why aren't they in London? So, anyway, I thought that was a good argument.
Thank you very,
Thank you
very
for
much.
that. Yes. Voilà. Thank you very much, Margarita.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Ναι.
Να βγάλει με το μικρόφωνο.
Ναι.
Πήγε πολύ ωραία. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Πόσο κράτησε, μια ώρα ή παραπάνω?
Μία ώρα ακριβώς το κράτησα.
Ναι, ωραία. Μια ώρα, ναι, πολύ ωραία.
Ετοιμάς κάτι.
Όσο έπρεπε, ναι.